Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 36. In this week's episode, I want to talk about something that has played a substantial role in my life as a young adult, what I do for a living. And this isn't something that I've talked in great detail about, but it is something that I'm very proud of. And I think discovering this work-life balance is something that obviously not only applies to my life, but I'm sure to a lot of you as well. I think when you're healing from any kind of abuse or trauma, the ways that these behaviors and responses can show up, not only personally, but also professionally, can sometimes feel confusing or challenging, and I think it's something worth talking about. Before we get into this week's episode, if you've been enjoying the podcast as much as I've enjoyed shooting it, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. That being said, let's dive right into it. When Brandon and I met back in 2018, we quickly realized that we were both very creative, very driven, and we both shared the same desire to have our own business one day, to be our own bosses. And in 2019, we started Path Design. And for a little bit of context, we mainly design and build custom furniture. We focus on creative home solutions, ways for you to best utilize your space so that visually and functionally, you're getting the most out of every single piece of furniture that you choose to surround yourself with. And it's something that we've both grown so passionate about. But I want to bring it back to the inception of Path. And to do that, we have to sort of take a trip back in time to my freshman year of college. It was my second semester, and I remember I was sitting in this humanities class that I had to pull a lot of strings to get into because he was a really sought-after professor, and every class he started off with 10 minutes of low-light meditation music, stream of consciousness writing. And I found myself one morning sitting there writing in my journal, saying, or writing, I guess, this is going to be my last day of school. Coming from my academic background, I graduated as the valedictorian of my 8th grade class and of my high school class of over 600 students. My GPA was 102. I had a very strong academic background and a very tight-knit relationship with school for the majority of my life. And so to come to a point where I was one semester into college, 2 weeks into my second semester, and I was feeling such a pull away from any kind of higher education was unexpected, to say the least. But personally, I felt like if I wanted to achieve the things that felt true to me, there wouldn't be a way for me to do that within the confines of a classroom any longer. I think I was expecting college to be this really eye-opening experience with new people and new places and a lot more freedom and space for self-discovery. But upon getting there, it felt very similar to high school. I think the structure was very similar. The assignments felt very similar. I was taking classes that I had already taken in high school just because they were a prerequisite for another class. And the school system in general, and I think my involvement in it, is going to lead to a future episode of It's Not Normal because I have a lot to say about the way that it's structured and how that kind of feeds into our identity and our role in the workplace as we move into adulthood. But for now, I want to focus on Path. So this idea was brewing to start my own business. And the first thing I thought was that I had to come up with a name. And I knew it was going to be centered around working with my hands, woodworking, design. I was in school for interior design at the time, and I really fell in love with the process of home building and construction and this idea that you can physically make something that you thought of, that you designed, you can bring it to life. And the way that you create it and how you place it in a space will inevitably impact how you function within that space and how you feel. And I just thought that that was so profound. It was such an innate part of life that really affects your day to day. And so I was running through all of these different names, and what I kept coming back to was this quote that I grew up around. It was something that I think it was one of the first things that I heard throughout my childhood that really stuck with me in an ideological way. And it's a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote that goes, "Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." And it really resonated with me, not only because of how it applies to life, but in that moment, how it was applying to my academic journey, my academic career, I guess. Going from someone who was always involved in every academic competition, I was very school focused, to then telling people that I was a college dropout. I thought that it was really profound the way that that quote was kind of intertwining itself with the way that I was feeling personally at that time in my life. Because I knew that that news would be a shock to friends and family alike, people who had known me my whole life. But just because I was choosing to leave school didn't make me any less of a person. And it didn't make my chances of success any less. And I remember the first day after I dropped out, waking up and going about my day, realizing that the world goes on. The sun came up. The people who were going to work are still going to work. The people who were going to school are still in that class that I was in yesterday. My personal decision didn't have this catastrophic impact that I think it can sometimes feel like it might when you're contemplating a decision as heavy as that. And so that is when the name Path Design was born, because I have always believed, and I continue to believe, that everyone's path to happiness and success is completely unique and individual. And getting there might be very unexpected. I don't think you have to follow a traditional path if that doesn't speak to you. I don't think you have to live an unconventional life if you crave that comfort and that stability. I think all of these things can be defined and should be defined by us. And so I dropped out. And that for me really marks the beginning of Path, because up until that point, I had been following the rules. I had been doing the things that I was told to do, that I was taught to do, that I believed everyone did. And for the first time, it sort of felt like I took my life into my own hands in an academic sense, and I was going to start pursuing a career that would be fulfilling to me as a person, as a creative, not just as a student. And so when I think back to the early days of Path, that is where it was born. And for a little while after that, I was experimenting and learning, and it wasn't until I met Brandon that we were able to join forces and bring this idea to fruition and actually start Path Design as a business. So 2 months after I moved out of my parents' house is when we got our first studio. And what's so interesting about that for me is that looking back, I never would have been able to do something like that had I still been living with my parents. And we've talked about this a lot before in videos and in podcast episodes. When you're dealing with an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent, they don't share in your happiness or success if it does not benefit them. And this was exactly one of those scenarios. I've talked about this referencing a road trip, something that was a bucket list dream of mine, that once I was finally able to do that, I had the opportunity in front of me. Because it didn't involve my parents, it wasn't celebrated by them. They tried to prevent it. And so I know that had I not moved out, this studio would not have happened. And so much of my early 20s took place in that studio. There was so much self-reflection and growth that took place there. Path was such a creative outlet for me during a really tumultuous time in my life. And to think that the people who are supposed to be who you're told are your biggest supporters, your biggest cheerleaders, they would have actively prevented me from having that opportunity and that experience because they didn't benefit from it. If anything, it would have consumed my time and energy. It would have taken me away from them and made me less available. I think it's also important to note that there's this idea that a narcissistic parent or an emotionally immature parent, their ego is very sensitive. I think they rely on a lot of external validation, and if there's ever anyone, especially within their inner circle, who is doing objectively better than them, if they're succeeding, if they're making personal strides in the right direction, that can sometimes shift the focus off of the parent onto this other person. And I think that can be incredibly threatening to them. And so they'll do anything that they can to redirect the attention back onto them. And so that is kind of the first realization that I've had in reflecting on this time in my life since I've learned everything that I have about narcissism and mental health. The idea that something so positive in my life would have been prevented if it were for the influence of my parents, if I were to still be living under their roof and allowed their influence to take precedence over my own wants, needs, and interests. And I will never forget the day that Brandon and I saw the space for the first time and made the decision that we were going to make a shop here. We were going to work here and bring all of our ideas that we had been talking about for months at that point to life. And we signed the lease. And I felt like such an adult. I felt so independent. It felt surreal, almost like I wasn't allowed to be doing this thing, or like what I was doing was wrong or sneaky. It didn't feel familiar to me because I think for most of my life up until that point, I had always kind of fallen in line and done the thing that I was supposed to do or expected to do or asked permission to do. I had someone's green light before I actually went ahead and made a decision. And so to make a decision to sign a lease for a commercial warehouse space for a year was one of the biggest decisions that I had made in my life up until that point. And it felt so good because for me, it was such a vote of confidence, not only for myself and for Brandon, but for us together and for the business that we were planning to start. It was almost like, well, now we're here. We have to make ends meet. We have to get to work. And it was such an inspiration, I think, to have that space and to have creative control over that space and to finally have a place where we could let our imaginations run wild. And so that first year was very much a year of growth and development and learning. And what I've realized is that having such a creative, positive outlet for me during this really traumatic, sort of tumultuous and emotional time in my life was so beneficial. When I reflect on that time, I can't imagine how I would have processed a lot of what I was going through had I had a more traditional job where I was waking up at a certain time and getting home at a certain time and my time and energy was directed towards someone else's goals. I think one of the things that running your own business allows you is time and space to think about what you want and what is important to you. And so Brandon and I learned so much, not only about woodworking and how to run a business, but about ourselves and about each other and the kind of relationship that we want to have, the kind of life that we want to create. And we were able to use a lot of that time in that space to try to understand and digest everything that had been happening in my personal life, how my personal relationships were changing and evolving, some of them ending, addressing a lot of the confusion and working through some of these trauma responses that at the time I didn't even know were trauma responses. And, I would say within the last year or two, that is when I've really been able to gain a bit of clarity on all of the different ways that my parents' behavior has negatively impacted me and sort of manifested itself in my adult life. And I don't think I was able to fully grasp how much of that fed into the early days of Path until recently, especially after I had a little bit of time away from it, which was really beneficial. For the last 6 or 8 months, I've been focusing on the podcast and creating videos on social media talking about mental health. And the behind the scenes of all of that is just tons and tons of research and self-reflection and conversations with other people who've gone through something similar. And it's allowed me to view my life, both past and present, through a completely different lens. And so what I want to talk about today is how a lot of my responses and my behavior sort of manifested themselves, not only personally, but also professionally, as I was starting and learning to run a business. I think this can be really valuable even if you have a more traditional job, to kind of help you discover that work-life balance. How can you set boundaries in the workplace? What are the things that you want to do? How can you sort of allow yourself time and space to support yourself, not only financially, but also personally? And the first thing that I want to touch on is this idea of self-worth and self-neglect. We did an entire podcast episode on self-neglect and the different ways that we are conditioned to neglect ourselves for someone else's benefit. And I think personally, again, speaking from my own experience, I was raised by emotionally immature parents, and I had a very strong academic background. And I think sometimes the combination of these two things can reinforce and really intensify a lot of these narratives that we grow up around. Do what you're told. Don't question authority. It's better to be seen and not heard. And then, of course, there's this idea that your value as a person is directly tied to the work that you do, to what you do rather than who you are. And I think that trickles down and translates to your self-worth, where you feel like if I'm not performing well, if I'm not being productive, if I'm not at the top of my class, then in some ways I am less than. And so I think those can be a really challenging combination if left unchecked. And I think that this can translate into adulthood, into the workplace, if we don't kind of step back and have a lot of these different realizations about our identity and our self-worth and our intrinsic value as a person, understanding that we have value simply for who we are rather than what we do. And so you can imagine coming from that kind of environment, having such a strong academic background, and now being in a position where I'm starting and running a business, I didn't cut myself any slack whatsoever. And that, I think, translated to quite a bit of self-neglect. And I guess the first thing that I want to touch on when we talk about self-neglect and path is this idea that throughout childhood, I think a lot of us are conditioned to believe that our time and energy is sort of up for grabs. Like we owe that to someone else. We're always expected to be available, whether that's physically being present at home or being emotionally available so that we can help our parent cope. We can listen to them vent. We can come up with solutions to problems that they're having. And I think this was very applicable for me in the early days of Path because I struggled to find a balance between when I was on and when I was off. I felt like I always had to be available to customers all the time. If we were working on a project or someone had a question, it didn't matter what day it was, what time it was. It could have been my birthday. I felt compelled to answer. I felt like it was my responsibility to be responsive. And I do want to note that I think this is partially entwined directly with entrepreneurship. I think when you're starting a business, you're going to have to put in a lot of hours, especially in the beginning, just to get yourself off the ground and to really get this business started. But I think it would be foolish to admit that being raised in an emotionally abusive or volatile environment doesn't in one way or another feed into your mentality when it comes to work. Again, whether that's a more traditional path or a less traditional path that you're taking. And so that was a big challenge for me in the beginning, was learning when to turn off and feeling okay turning off ever. I think I always felt like if I wasn't working, if I wasn't physically working and building something, then I should be answering emails. If I don't have any emails to answer, then let me send out some cold emails, or let me work on the website. How are our business cards? Do they need to be updated? There was sort of this never-ending list of things to do, and I felt like any and all time that I had should be directed towards this goal. And I learned that this wasn't entirely sustainable. And yet we were working 12-hour days. We would be at the studio every single day of the week. And I think at the height of it, we weren't eating very well. We weren't getting outside nearly as much as we should have. We were inside all day, working until the early hours of the morning, just to come home, sleep, and then go back and do it again. We didn't have a real work-life balance. And again, I think if you're going into a new business and you're committing a lot of time and energy to this thing, I think it's fine to pour so much of yourself into something, into a goal that you're working towards, as long as you're aware of what you're doing. And I think that is where the connection between this and being raised by emotionally immature parents kind of comes into play, because I think a lot of us lack that self-awareness, and we lack the ability to ask ourselves, again, these really important questions. Do I like this? Do I not like this? How am I feeling? Is this a positive or a negative? How do I move forward? I think we're so conditioned to expend our energy outward onto other people that it can be a real series of lessons to finally learn to turn it inward and to ask ourselves those questions. And so I felt like if I wasn't working, then in some ways I was less than, like I should always be working. And any little bit of downtime that I had, I felt incredibly guilty for. I couldn't even enjoy it because I was always thinking of something else. My mind was always elsewhere, and I felt like I'm wasting time, like I don't need to be doing this. And I think, to piggyback off of that, to keep with this idea of self-neglect, when you're starting a business, chances are you're exchanging some kind of a product or a service for money. People are paying you for that. I think a side note, being raised by a narcissistic parent or an emotionally immature parent, it is not uncommon for financial abuse to be worked into that cycle in one way or another. And that is certainly something that I have dealt with. And so my relationship to money is something that's always evolving and something that I'm continually trying to heal. But in the early days of the business, I remember feeling guilty for asking people for anything, for charging anything for my product, my service, my work, my time. I think I grew so conditioned to believe that I should just be available to people, that my time and energy was not necessarily my own. It was sort of up for grabs. And who am I? Who am I to actually place value on my ideas or on my work? And so that was another real challenge, to create a business that is sustainable, learning when to turn on, when to turn off, when to kind of draw that line, and how to feel comfortable being compensated for the time, energy, and effort that you're putting into creating something. And that, I think, feeds directly into this next point that I want to talk about, which is boundaries. I know personally, and from so many of you that I've talked to, the word boundary was not even in our vocabulary until early adulthood. And I remember thinking, throughout childhood, who am I to say what is and isn't okay? I'm not the authority figure here. I'm the child. I'm the person who listens, and I adapt. And I think this idea of self-neglect and self-worth kind of ties directly into the idea of learning how to set boundaries for yourself, not only personally, but also professionally. And again, I think this is applicable whether you're self-employed, whether you have your own business, or if you're employed, if you're working for someone else. I think you have to learn how to set boundaries in the workplace so that you can actually show up in a way that is sustainable for the business and for yourself. I think so much of what I've learned throughout my healing journey is that if I am able to show up for myself, I will then be able to show up for everyone and everything else in my life in a much better, more sustainable way. I have to turn my focus inward. I have to ask myself a lot of those really important questions. I have to say no when I feel like I need to say no so that I can give myself the time and space that I need to rest or to recuperate so that I can show up as the best version of myself when I need to or when I want to. I think when you're raised in that kind of environment, it feels like you're on duty 24/7, like you're always holding your breath or tensing your muscles, waiting for the next thing to happen. And I think if you apply that same mentality to work, it's inevitably going to lead to burnout, which is exactly what I want to talk about next. I have probably been burnt out on more than one occasion in my life, but I think it was one of those instances throughout school, mainly throughout high school, where I didn't yet have the vocabulary to describe the feeling or what was going on in my personal life. And so it was just part of the experience. But now, having learned as much as I have, I can understand that expending so much time and energy on something so consistently, leaving no room for rest or recuperation, is not sustainable. And when you're starting and running a business, I think the idea of rest and recuperation and time away can sometimes feel counterproductive, but in truth, it is so necessary to the sustainability of your business because it's directly tied to the sustainability of yourself and your own mental state. And so I think the combination of my self-worth and my value being directly tied to what I was producing, I think my lack of boundaries and also perfectionism, hypervigilance, hyperfixation, all of these behaviors and responses that so many of us develop as a result of being raised by emotionally immature parents, all kind of tied together and eventually led up to me feeling incredibly burnt out, more burnt out than I have ever been in my entire life. And it all came to a head the day before Christmas Eve. Now, the holiday season for us was always very busy and continues to be. Thanksgiving, Christmas, people want a nice dining room table or a nice new piece of furniture for when all of their family come to visit. And so this particular December, we were the busiest that we ever were. And in one breath, I think we were so excited that so many people were seeking us out for work that we wanted to challenge ourselves and see how much we could do. And I think in another breath, we had no idea about a work-life balance. We had no idea how to set boundaries with ourselves in the workplace. And so we took on way too much work. But again, being so fearful of making mistakes or ever letting anyone down, ever not following through with something that I say that I'm going to do, we made it happen. And we spent 8 hours in a U-Haul that day on 30 minutes of sleep, delivering to 5 different people across multiple states so that they would have what they wanted before Christmas Day. And the reason that I say that burnout came to a head this day is because driving that U-Haul back at 11 p.m., I was so exhausted. It was the first time that I ever felt like this might not be the smartest thing to do, just because of how physically exhausted I was. And so for the first time, I felt like I could have been compromising my safety for the sake of work. And it didn't quite feel worth it for me. And I remember thinking to myself, and Brandon and I talking about it, that we would never do something like that again. And what followed was also really interesting. It was Christmas, it was New Year's. And so I feel like that week or two, no one really expects you to be doing any kind of substantial work. And so all I wanted was time away. I didn't want to build anything. I didn't want to be at the studio. And what I realized was this sort of oversaturation of work, just constantly focusing on the same thing and leaving no time or space for any sort of personal development outside of that, almost drove me away from it. And I think in some ways that made me sad, because building, creating, woodworking, these are all things that I'm so passionate about that I felt like I was getting in my own way. I was kind of preventing myself in the way that I was working from truly reaping the benefits of the things that I'm most passionate about and being able to enjoy them fully. And so over the course of the last year or so, I've learned so much more about myself and about mental health that not only am I able to apply these things in the present and in the future, but I'm also able to reflect on the past and how all of these different behaviors sort of made their way to the surface unknowingly and impacted myself and my own mental health, and in turn, the way that I was able to approach a business. And now that I've learned all of this, I think I can take it with me and apply it positively, again, not only to myself and my own mental health, but to Path. And we can move forward in a way that is much more sustainable, that is much more enjoyable. We can avoid burnout. I feel so much more confidence in myself. I think there's much less imposter syndrome than I felt in the beginning. I understand that my time is valuable and it's okay for me to be compensated for my ideas and my work. I can turn my phone off after a certain time, or if I'm going out for the day and I just want to be present in the moment, I can answer the email tomorrow. I understand that I inherently have value as a person outside of my work, and so my self-worth isn't directly tied to what I'm producing any longer. And I think that mentality is exponentially healthier than the mentality that I started this business with. And for that, I am so grateful for the resources that are out there for mental health and for this community that we have been able to build. It has provided me with so much clarity personally and professionally. And I think, as we come to the end of this week's episode and we're talking about sort of this new revitalized approach that I think I have to Path, I want to ask you, how do you follow your path? What are you the most passionate about that if you knew everything would work out, you would just go for it? I think it's so common when you're raised being parentified, you're taking on a lot of adult responsibilities from a very young age. You aren't often left with the time or space to develop a lot of your own passions or personal interests. I think personal successes can sometimes be discouraged when you're raised by an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent because they're continually trying to shift the spotlight back onto them. They might discourage you from doing something that you really and truly love, that you might be really good at, simply because they don't want the attention to be shifted to you, even for a moment. And so, what would you do if it was up to you? If you had all of the freedom in the world to dedicate as much time as you wanted to the thing that you're most passionate about, what would that be? And how would you make that a reality? Do you think that would positively impact your life and the lives of people around you? I think so much of the essence of Path is this idea that the world can be a better place if everyone was allowed the time and space to discover and dedicate time to the thing that they're most passionate about. Because not only would you be so interested in learning and evolving and becoming the best at this thing, you would dedicate a lot of time and attention to detail to create the best product. But in turn, I think everyone else would be much happier, much more content. They would be receiving something that was handmade with love, or it's an entirely different mentality than I think so many of us have grown used to, and yet it seems so simple when you step back and really think about it. And so with that, I want to encourage each and every single one of you to follow your path. I want to encourage each and every single one of you to remember that your value, your self-worth is not directly tied to what you do. You have intrinsic value simply for who you are, the things that you bring to this world as a person. I want you to remember that you don't live to work, you work to live. And I think the more that we can close that gap between the things that we have to do to sustain ourselves and to support ourselves and the things that we want to do, the better off we can all be. So that is path. That is a huge part of my life. It is still how Brandon and I support ourselves, and it's partially why I've been a little less active on social media for the last week or two. We have had quite an influx of projects, and while I'm extremely excited about them, not only in their design, but sometimes I crave getting back out into the garage and working with my hands. But it has proven to be a challenge for me to split my time and energy between building and creating on social media. And it's something that I'm continually figuring out. I'm applying all of these new ideas, this new mentality to this very time in my life. And that's why I wanted to talk about that this week, because it is incredibly relevant to what I am feeling and what I'm going through currently. So with that, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode. But if you enjoyed it, again, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.